Well, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I am Andrew Casey with BIOTECanada. A huge welcome to you during Global Biotech Week 2021. Looking forward to a fantastic discussion this morning. I'm joined by two of my global colleagues from Europe and the US. I'll introduce Claire Skentelbery, who's the Director General of EuropaBio, and Michelle McMurry-Heath, who is the President and CEO of BIO, which is the Biotech Industry Association down in the US. Welcome to both of you. Good to see you both.
Great to be with you.
So what we're going to try and do today, I think we've got a really interesting opportunity to explore some of what's happening globally with our industry. I was reflecting and sort of thinking about this conversation as I looked at both of you have joined recently your organizations. Claire, you joined in November of 2020, and Michelle, you joined last June in 2020. I've been at BIOTECanada since 2012, and as an organization that's been doing advocacy work on behalf of an industry, it's always an uphill battle where you're trying to get policymakers to pay attention to your industry and the importance that you think it represents, both to the economy, but in our case, obviously, to the health of the global population. It was always an uphill battle. Now, though, with the pandemic, I don't think I ever want to go through this again. I wish it had never happened. But the reality is that if anything has focused policymakers' attention on an industry and the value of the industry, the pandemic has. And certainly in Canada, we've seen government recognize that it doesn't want to go through the situation again of trying to find solutions to build for a response to the pandemic, but also now prepare for future pandemics, which is only prudent. And so they're investing significant amounts into the biotech sector. And I'm just curious, as we sort of explore Biotechnology Week, and it's about celebrating this industry, has this been the experience for you and your organizations on behalf of your members? And maybe I'll start in Europe, Claire, and sort of get a sense as to what's been happening in Europe.
Yes, it was, although I joined EuropaBio sort of, the pandemic was already well underway when I started, so there was this sort of surreal element of starting with everybody remotely. It has been fascinating at the different types of light it shines on biotechnology. From the first point, you're like, when have we ever in history before gone through our life? And the second question you ask anybody is, so which vaccine do you have? That has literally never happened. So it's really taught us that if we can't sell and promote biotech this year, we can literally never do this, because there is so much awareness of the role that it plays in rapid response to aspects, and also the complexity and depth of the foundation that it needs to be able to make that response. So what we've seen in Europe, and indeed you'll have seen it in US and Canada as well, is that on one hand, you've got an urgent need to address an immediate health threat. So you need products and processes to be developed, but they also need to be available. And it's shown us that the global supply chain around medicines, and not just the finished products, but every single complex part of that process, has come under incredible strain, and asked the question, had we stretched them too thin before? How do we make sure that those supply chains are more robust? And this is not just about talking about reshoring production inside your own territories, but making sure that the global partnerships and pathways for drug development function well and don't disadvantage anybody when it's put under strain in the future. Because it's all well and good looking at this from like a mature economy perspective, but everybody is in this same boat at the moment. So for Europe, it's been really interesting because they needed to have the vaccine, but we're now also facing the fact that we all need economic generation. So the conversation is, how do you combine our response to COVID with economic generation through biotechnology, through advanced manufacturing? How does this sit from a global perspective? Because we had huge amounts of interaction between Europe and the US during the really critical days to ensure that medicines were flowing and vaccines were going to be available. It's opened up a huge number of discussions. But for Europe as well, it had already started to relook at things like pharmaceutical legislation. So this is going on in parallel. So one of the main things I've seen is that we can now use examples from COVID response and say, okay, well, if you change this in the pharmaceutical legislation, you realize it will affect the supply chain in this way or that way. You know, if nothing else, COVID has given us something where you can use accessible examples of how biotech works to say, if you change this again in the future, this will happen or this will not happen. So it's made an already complex sector more complex, but it's given us some really clear examples to use when we're talking to policymakers.
It's remarkable, actually, that awareness piece that you talked about, which was, you know, which vaccine have you had? I would actually go almost a step further. I've had questions like, when would you have ever thought that people could talk about mRNA? 3 years ago, it would have been impossible to imagine somebody having a conversation about that, and yet it became part of our everyday lexicon. Michelle, what's sort of been your experience at Bio?
Yeah, it's kind of been you have both the best of it and the worst of it. So I've got to start by saying the public awareness of everything we do has been incredible. You know, you talk about mRNA. I have a 9-year-old, and at my daughter's school, parents come up to me and ask me about clinical trial design and what does a placebo mean and what can we really trust when it comes to scientific data. And that level of public awareness and sensitivity to the process of biotech is amazing. I never thought I'd see it in my lifetime, and it's fantastic to see. Unfortunately, along with that has come a lot of undue attention as well. I think people have realized what a valuable resource biotech is, and that's led to some hoarding, some over-regulating of supply chains, some fear and nationalism, as well as a conversation to try to constrain the cost so that there can be more availability. And as we all know, all of those things are linked, and it's really an ecosystem. And I think Claire described this very rational set of conversations with policymakers. For us, we're trying to link the ecosystem with everything else they're seeing so they can realize how valuable this is to rebuilding the economy, to protecting our health, to being prepared for the next pandemic. But it's been slow going, I will say. We're starting to make some slight headway, but it's been a bit slow going.
And just on that, I mean, I think the ecosystem is an interesting, this sort of takes us into an interesting direction, because I think it ties into, Claire, your earlier comments as well about the regulatory frameworks that are being put in place. And a lack of recognition in terms of the ecosystem, I liken it a little bit to a coral reef, right? Where you need all the components of a coral reef have to be healthy if you're going to have a healthy coral reef. You can't just take out a fish that you don't like or not feed it, or you can't have a coral reef without plankton. So that all has to be there and healthy and viable. And I think where you're going with that, Michelle, is the whole idea that we've got all the great early stage companies that are developing these cool innovations, but there's got to be a recognition of the important role that the multinational pharmaceutical companies play in there. So there's a sort of pricing dynamic or listing and reimbursement thing that's going on. Maybe just back to you, Michelle, is to sort of unbundle that a little bit and talk about what has that changed at all for you? Because it's been a challenge for us in Canada, to be sure. And I want to know what your experience has been, and Claire, that likewise yours.
Yeah, I think policymakers are just really confused. You know, many of them in the US have run on demonizing large pharmaceutical companies. It's still the flavor of company that our lawmakers love to hate. And they almost can't reckon with the fact that large pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer and J&J have brought them the vaccine. And they're still very open to small biotechs. They see them in all of their congressional districts. They understand that they're linked to good paying jobs, as well as American economic competitiveness globally. But they almost can't reconcile these two sides of their brain. And it's really been our job to try to bring in investors into the conversation to say, look, this is how these are linked. And this is the domino effect you will create with some of the misguided legislation that's being discussed right now. But it's a huge challenge, and it's not just our policymakers. I also see it with the general public as well. We haven't done enough to kind of paint the full picture. You know, we all tried. It's not a picture that many people take a keen interest in, but we have to find a way to make it even more compelling in the years to come.
Yeah, I think I can really add on to that. Yeah, I can certainly add on to that, and it's really interesting because the whole ecosystem of biotechnology relies on all of those as you say, all of those organisms being there, because you can have as much early stage innovation as you want and as many startups as you want, but there comes a point where you need larger vehicles to help amplify, and you look perhaps at the investment in infrastructure. That's been a huge discussion during COVID, related directly to vaccine manufacture. This stuff does not fall from the sky. You have to build and staff incredibly skilled setups to be able to manufacture something, not even just at a small scale, but at a scale that is large and consistent and can pass through the regulatory processes. And all of those things require those different actors to have a footprint in those ecosystems. And I think, just as Michelle was saying about the disconnect within policymakers between, evil big guys, good little guys, it's really important to understand that if you disincentivize a large company to produce something in a country, in your territory, then you take out a really large piece of that ecosystem, because not only is that infrastructure gone, but the skills associated with it have gone as well. And the layers of expert service providers that build up around that, which are absolutely critical to the function and the delivery of earlier stage innovation. None of these things can happen in isolation. And I think that's a big learning curve for people as well.
In some respects, we're kind of victims of the success of the response during COVID, right? If you think back to the early days, everyone anticipated there would be therapeutics available before there would be vaccines, and vaccines were only expected to be 3 to 5 years out if you based it on previous experience during the Ebola crisis, and that we all of a sudden had 2 highly effective vaccines in the mRNA field very early on, and then others that followed quickly thereafter. It almost gave everybody the impression that this is actually quite easy, that you can just sort of quickly turn stuff around. And in fact, it's been, I think, part of the anti-vax problem, which has been these things came out of nowhere. We have them overnight. And when, obviously it took many, many years for these technologies to develop. But now the expectation is, well, you can quickly do that. So how hard can this really be? Is it really that complex? Do you really need all this investment dollars? And are they really that expensive? So I think while it's a remarkable success story, it's also going to compound, I think, our challenge of, and Michelle, you talked about like the big evil companies, right? And all they're doing is bringing cheap products here and charging outrageous prices for it. So I do think that we've got to work through that a little bit. The other part I just want to pick up on is it's almost like it's a bit of a choice for policymakers, and I'm not quite convinced that they don't understand that there's a difference. I think they actually choose not to deal with the reality of the complexity. So it's easier. I call the early stage companies the cute cuddly puppies. Everybody wants to pick up the cute cuddly puppies and embrace them and talk about how much they love them. But there's a lot of work. If anybody has a dog, there's a lot of work that goes into having a puppy. And so you actually have to take care of them. You have to nurture them. There's all sorts of training and walking, blah, blah, all the rest of it. So I think policymakers have chosen not to deal with that part. And I think our role, at least certainly what I'm seeing in Canada, is to try and bring it back together to say, you have to understand how connected this is. And if you choose to ignore one and you put in place regulatory policies that force the industry to sort of look elsewhere, you'll lose the jobs, you'll lose the investment. And I think a great example is if you look at the Pfizer vaccine, that's Pfizer partnering with BioTech out of Germany and Acuitas out of Canada. So that's the old model of Pfizer doing everything by itself, for itself, in-house is gone. It's a global enterprise. It sort of goes out and scouts, it finds new products, brings it all together, it's investment, it's partnership. Maybe let's just explore a little bit of that and how that you've seen from that perspective. And Michelle, you're closer to the Pfizer stuff in the U.S., but what's been the experience there?
Yeah, well, it's very frustrating to me because there is this focus on how our big pharmaceutical companies that play a key role, they are expert at commercializing, globalizing, going through the clinical and regulatory hurdles that are necessary to reassure the public, and to fine-tune doses and uses. And no one wants to really appreciate that and talk about it. And no one wants to talk about the really low-hanging policy fruit for reducing those costs. So for example, here in the US, we've gone now almost 10 months without a commissioner of the US Food and Drug Administration. We have not been investing the dollars into the FDA that allows them to do the high-touch real-time reviews and work with innovators that was so successful in bringing the COVID vaccines quickly to patients. So, and I have a CEO who says, 90% of my cost and 90% of my time are clinical trials. We need to be talking about what we can do to reduce some of those burdens in a way that still gives confidence to the public so that we can bring down the overall cost and time, more importantly, of producing these innovations. And there's a kind of deafness among policymakers to what they can do. The other example of this kind of blindness is the Defense Production Act here in the US. Our government has invoked this really benign sounding initiative to really stop exports of raw materials for mRNA vaccines around the world, to insist that our vaccine manufacturers fill US orders first. And what has that resulted in? It's resulted in not only global shortages of vaccines and frustration and anger, but it's also resulted in now shortages in all of our gene and cell therapy companies as well to get the equipment and raw materials that they need to succeed. So we have a lot of focus on the wrong levers. And I really hope policymakers come to understand the ones that they really control, so that they can be a useful part of the program. I don't think it's an accident that the leader in Europe against the TRIPS waiver conversation is a scientist. I think we have to do more to get scientists into policymaking roles because they understand the process and the uncertainty. And I'm not sure when we explain it to people, they fully grasp it and believe it.
I can absolutely agree with all of that. And it's really interesting to look, because while you were talking, I was thinking, especially in Europe, you have policymakers that come at this from many different angles. If we're going to make something complex, we will make it complex. You've got national policymakers, you have regional policymakers. I speak as a proud Belgian. And then you've got European policymakers, and on the European level, you've got your MEPs, you've got the European Commission. And biotech is such a complex machine with so many moving parts. You can make a seemingly innocuous change somewhere that goes, well, what could possibly be wrong with doing this? It's a very noble thing. But then the rest of the machine can't function properly. So I think that's what we have to do really well, is explain that if you change this small, seemingly innocent thing, it's going to impact, over there before you can see it. And we see this exactly with biotech. But on the other side as well, I was really interested. It's great that some small companies were so closely aligned with the COVID vaccine development, because, of course, Pfizer and BioNTech were already working together. They'd been working together around mRNA for something else. And it was an extraordinary stroke of luck on one part that it was actually ready, and they had a trusted enough relationship to go, I tell you what, let's throw it at this. But on the other side of that, it's you make your own luck. That wasn't there entirely randomly. That's 20 years of investment in mRNA development. It is the changing landscape between pharmaceutical companies and small companies. If I look back to when I started in biotech sort of 20 odd years ago, that was when biotech SMEs suddenly exploded onto the scene, because a lot of the big pharmaceutical companies were scaling down their in-house investment and releasing assets and skills into the community at the same time that private investment became available. So the biotech sector boomed. And then you realize that the pharma companies kind of went too far that way, in that they then didn't have enough in-house to keep growing with and needed to partner with external companies. But it shows how incredibly important it was to learn from each other in this process. We spoke to Pfizer earlier this year about their relationship with BioNTech, and they said it taught Pfizer so much about how to remember to think like an SME again. to say, to be able to push the risks forward, which they wouldn't have done if they hadn't been working with a small company. So there's, for me as well, it's fascinating the ecosystem and the learning and the relationships that are so core to this being possible. Because on another day in another country, the mRNA vaccine would not have emerged from Pfizer and BioNTech. So it's
and we
the
need
science,
these
it's
different
the relationships.
We need these different cultures, right? We need, the cautious, reproducible, methodical culture of our large pharmaceutical companies to reliably get products to patients around the world. And we need this risk-taking maverick spirit and lack of fear and concern for future consequences in our small companies, so that they'll try absolutely every scientific possibility and hone it down to the ones that work. We need those different cultures, and it's so valuable for patients to have them both.
It's such a great point. I'd not thought of it in that way until you said it. And when you think about this global challenge and having those mavericks out there trying everything, right? And you've probably had the same experience when you took on your new roles. You met with your members, and I remember doing this, going out across the country, talking to them. And I'm not a scientist, unlike the two of you that have much more scientific background than I do. But I remember walking away from having met with all these entrepreneurs thinking, well, why are we worried about cancer? It's done. These guys have the solution, right? You fall in love with them, you fall in love with their technology and their passion, and usually there's a history there's some sort of personal connection for them. And you just love to see that sort of thriving entrepreneur out there that's just trying to solve for the big problems. But there's a realization, of course, right, that the problems are global. And if you do happen to strike it and really find that solution like a BioNTech, you got to find some way to get it to the world. And that's where the big companies, you got to produce it at scale, you got to distribute it at scale, you have to have your connections, your marketing, and that's a big enterprise. And so connecting those two is so critical. I mean, there's going to be some obviously in the rare disease space where the 300 patients around the world. Okay, that's fairly easy to address. But in situations like the pandemic, you've got that bigger challenge of actually getting it out to a global population. We still are facing that. I mean, and you think about, Claire, you mentioned this earlier, the sort of the upstream and downstream, the logistics, the ability to sort of assemble and get the ingredients and put it in. And Michelle, I've heard you talk around the trips about how many ingredients go into the Pfizer vaccine and all the different sources that's coming from and how challenging that is. So I think that's a really important thing to recognize going forward. It's just that global nature of the industry and the reach of it, right? I think that this is, and again, here we are, Global Biotech Week, but I think understanding that. And then the other challenge, of course, and I think one of the benefits, or I guess one of the experiences that we saw through the pandemic was the ability of regulators to sort of cooperate, share data with the companies. Probably more than we'd ever seen before when it came to the vaccines was this ability to sort of say, you know what, we're all in this together. We're going to do it whatever we can to move this thing forward. Do you think there are any lessons that regulators and I guess to a certain extent the industry have learned in sort of as we address the pandemic, but are there things we can take out of this going forward?
Well, I'll jump in there. Sure. I can definitely say with confidence that the U.S. Food and Drug Administration is about 1/10 of the size that it needs to be. I mean, it's one of the smaller health agencies. It operates on a shoestring, and yet it regulates 30% of every U.S. dollar. And if we really want our regulators to have the skills, the scientific acumen, as well as the time and mental bandwidth to work closely with innovators and to look under the hood, to probe, to ask every question, to be 100% sure of their decisions, then we need to staff it accordingly. And we need to realize what an important role it brings. Most of my member companies are really bereft about the state of regulation right now in the US because they want more regulators. They want more investment there. They want more contact with them. And that's not always the assumed relationship, but I think innovators know you have to work closely with regulators so that you know the questions they're going to need answers to as you go along. You cannot wait till the very end and have them parachute in and ask for completely different sets of evidence and data.
That is so right. And during COVID, we had nothing but praise for the heroic efforts of the regulators. They literally worked day and night. And you look at it from the US perspective, so I'll bring the European side in as well. Our regulatory system is structured really differently to yours. It's not one single organization, but you've got the EMA, then you've got many of the national agencies. So they both have advantages and disadvantages. But the key thing is, the core thing is they need more resources, because they're not just there to be a bottleneck or a gateway. They should be growing and learning and enabling innovation at the same time. And so often we see, in Europe, we'll see legislation that's 20 years out of date for the technologies that are now traveling through it. And if the regulatory structure is built on a particular process, then if that process is now obsolete, it becomes a massive rate limiting step. So I think there's a lot of times where you see people going, no, the regulators play too much of a role, we should have more freedom to make our own minds up. But on the other side, and policymakers will say, well, they're very expensive. I'm not putting more money into the public domain like this, but they're actually a core part of the engine. So what you put in, you will get out for sure in terms of advanced products. And the more resources they have, the more closely they can work together, because they will have slightly more bandwidth to touch base on emerging technologies, common problems. You see the fragmentation where they literally don't have time to sit in a room and talk about this.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing that's so interesting about the regulatory space as well is that they have not embraced the modern technology of understanding clinical data. The real world evidence was the big missed opportunity in the COVID vaccine story. For example, we're facing childhood vaccinations for COVID, hopefully end of October, beginning of November. I think it's the same in Europe, right? And that delay, not having vaccines ready for school-age kids when they went back to school, is due to the FDA early in the summer and the spring asking for vaccine manufacturers to double the size of their pediatric trials because of concern about cardiac toxicity. Now, the toxicity they're looking for is a 1 in a million occurrence, and they're doubling a trial from 1,500 to 3,000 patients. You're not going to detect it with that sort of resolution. And so it just means we're letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we're putting people at risk because we don't understand how the real world is telling us what we need to know about a lot of medical products. Sorry, I'll get on my bandwagon.
That's allowed. But it really underscores it. So combine that last sort of thought, Michelle, and another statement that you made that it's the FDA is 1/10 of the size that it needs to be, which really struck me, because as you're outlining right there, I think it's important to remember that the FDA, while of course its primary responsibility is to American citizens, it plays an enormous global role, right? So it's in asking for that enlarged clinical trial for 5 to 11-year-olds, it's delaying it in terms of its access to the global population, right? Because it's got to go through the US first, and then eventually it's going to come to Canada and to Europe, and we depend so much on the FDA. And I know for most of our companies in Canada, the first place they go to is the FDA. They're not looking for regulatory approval. And if you look at regulation through a competitive lens, if you have a very robust and modernized regulatory system that is efficient and effective, it's a competitive advantage. But how do we get there? And particularly as you think about, we've sort of muddled our way through COVID, but when you think about those mavericks out there and what they're working on, they're the gene therapies, the cell therapies that are coming. There's some amazing technologies. Are we ready for them?
No, unfortunately. But we need to be.
All
we
right.
need to be. Because they're coming fast and furious, and patients desperately want these technologies. And so we have to be prepared for them, and we're just not living up to that commitment right now. Hopefully we will soon.
Yeah, it's a really nice point, because again, looking at it from the European perspective, we've got things that are rate limiting steps that don't need to be there. They're not really based on a particularly scientific thing. So I can give you the example of GMO legislation. originally developed a pretty long time ago, very much in response to plants, also applies into medicine. So you've got gene therapy trials, we're seeing fragmentation across Europe, which just puts people off because a lot of that legislation has been implemented and interpreted at national level. So although you've got umbrella legislation at the top, you then have 27 different sets of national regulation and legislation and data requirements to jump through. So those things, from a European perspective, I think we need to do that. It's not about inventing the next technology. It's about making it smoother for existing technologies to progress. Europe has a huge innovation base, huge, and it's invested in it so incredibly well over the years. Where it stumbles more is the ensuring that once that innovation is born, that it can grow as it should. And that's not to say that all that innovation will get to the market. That's not how innovation development works. There's always a sort of fatality rate among technology for lots of different reasons, often unconnected to science. But where there are advances to be had, I think we need to make those pathways as smooth as possible, because then that unlocks things like the level of investment, scale of investment. It unlocks many things that then the public purse does not have to pay for. We shouldn't be pushing technologies forward with public money all the time. We should be enabling the market to pull it with investment and very positive outlook.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point, because here in the US, we're facing this conversation around ARPA-H, this idea that the government can actually make new biotech discoveries completely on its own, and that by investing $500 billion over 10 years, the government will be able to make these products completely without the private sector. And having worked in both the government and the private sector, I can tell you sitting here today that is not what we will see. And we tried the experiment before with the National Center for Accelerating Translational Science, and it did not work. So, and I think you've tried that experiment in Europe as well. So we have to start learning from the past a little bit better.
Absolutely. I've been involved in biotech, particularly small company development, for my whole career. And I see where often public money will go in, and it's always needed to prime the pump. It should always be going in at the beginning to make things work. But after a point, you're artificially keeping a technology alive, where while it's maturing from a technical perspective, it may never have an application in a patient population or in a product, because you're artificially maturing it. It's not being allowed to be assessed and brought on by the market. And I think it's a well-meaning thing, but I've seen it in Europe 1,000 times across all the countries, across all the regions in all the countries. You need critical mass of a technology development, not 2,700 different tiny little technologies all funded at the same time to try and push them forward. It's an interesting challenge, and I think we could learn to be more effective in how we target the public aspect of technology advance.
Yeah, I think a critical piece here is, when you start with a company or an idea, you can fall in love with that idea and sort of keep it going and throw money after it because you're so convinced it's going to work. I think probably both of you have experienced this as well. Certainly you've seen it here, is that you're far better off to see where the investors go and see, because they understand it. They understand the science, they understand the business element to it. And if something is working, more investors are there. I think there's a better strategic use of government dollars or public funds, more appropriately, to be invested in companies that are actually so accelerate their growth and commercialization and scaling up. But by then they're kind of more proven. And I think rather than trying to start stuff that's new and then get caught up in it, right? I think that's let the markets actually do what they need to do. I think that's going to be probably a better way to do it. I hear what you're saying, Michelle, because we see it with our government as well, which is we're going to solve for this by building it all ourselves. But their tendency, of course, is to not think of it through a commercial lens. So you build a facility, in the case of a vaccine facility and preparing for the next COVID, you build a facility, then you put paper on the windows, you turn the lights out, and you close the door and lock it, and then you come back to it when you need it for that emergency. Well, We all know that that's not how it works. You've got to stay GMP. It's got to have every expertise has got to be sort of as well up to speed as possible. And so the only way to do that is to have it be commercial. You just can't have it sort of sit there idling, waiting for the next emergency. And the best way to do that is to actually let the commercial companies who know how to do this stuff do it, and work with them in partnership. I think is a key part here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would really quickly say there as well. Sorry, Michelle, please carry on.
No, go ahead.
I was actually just thinking about, Andrew, when you said, about let the market decide. I think the policymakers should look at why the investors do or do not invest in something and go, well, if there is an unmet medical need, but they're not investing in that, why are they not investing in it where we know there is a destination need for it? So it's not that they're all completely right all the time, but they will show you where weaknesses in the system are that could be changed through policy, rather than expecting them to go, right, I'm going to fund this rare disease all the way through to the market, where in fact you could fix that at a different point in the chain.
Yeah, you need a dispassionate filter involved. We want innovators to be passionately in love with their ideas. Otherwise those ideas won't get developed and, fully tried and tested. But at a certain point, you also need the market's dispassionate lens on whether or not they meet the muster. And we have this sense that we can just do this and replicate it automatically. And we've seen, for example, in one of our studies that as you go through phase 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials, the higher percentage of National Institutes of Health funding you have on a project, the less likely it is to succeed. Meaning if the only money in it towards the late stage clinical development is government money, that's pretty much a sign of a failure because the private sector has not been attracted into it. So we need to learn those lessons and realize that government doesn't have the culture or the setup to really serve that purpose.
It's those 2 points together are kind of interesting. If you think about if we'd had this discussion 4 years ago, we said, there's a real need for mRNA vaccines in the case of a pandemic. Governments would have gone, yeah, okay, maybe, but okay, we'll pay 10 cents a vaccine or whatever it is. And so there's not that pull, right? So to Claire's point, that's where the role of government can sort of say, all right, instead of investing in companies, we sort of have to identify the areas that we need to address and pull those technologies out. So the investors will then go to them because at the moment, there's no demand for mRNA vaccine or AMR vaccine, right? So that's where that kind of important role. And then Michelle, you make the great point. Like if they're in late, then that's the death knell, right? Because the investors have already left, saying there's just nothing there, and the only thing keeping it afloat. And then you're into it's a political decision as opposed to a scientific decision, which is just the worst place to be. I'm going to shift gears just slightly because I think we all have this experience of just fantastic companies. We see the investment now flowing. Certainly, the experience in Canada has been that even through the pandemic, companies of all sizes have been securing investment, IPOs, driving their technology forward, growing in just an incredibly rapid rate. And running into now the new brick wall. It used to be, can we get investment dollars? Now it's, do we have the people? And so you've got companies that are doubling in size and trying to find the right people. And this is a global issue, right? Because if you're a chief scientific officer, a chief medical officer, and you can go to San Francisco, you can go to Paris, to London, whatever it is, or you can go to Toronto, and you're young or unencumbered by a family, like these people are moving all over the place. And as we're facing a real challenge here, both for early stage companies, but even for the large multinational pharma companies, so as they're trying to find people to sort of drive their innovations forward. Has that been the experience in both of your jurisdictions? Michelle, go first.
I would say yes, and that it goes again right back to the beginning of the biotech sector. It was, when I was starting at my first network in, I think, like 2003, the bottleneck that we agreed was access to skills and experience. It wasn't the science. And I'd say that's probably still the same now, especially that we have a generational shift in technologies. We're digitalizing, there we have sustainable transformations that we need to make. So there's a whole new mix of skills as well as the technology skills. We need to add in digital, we need to add in sustainability, and those skill sets are still kind of growing through. So there's huge demand for that capability. It's a really interesting, but good, it's a positive challenge, because the day you don't need any additional skills is the day that your sector is not going to go anywhere anymore. So it's how quickly can we respond to that and move people around to meet the needs.
Yeah, I mean, talent is the scarcest of scarce resources for all of our member companies. And I think the one pivot we may see from COVID that will have the most impact on our industry is that for the first time, we're recruiting young, bright people to the field because they see it as having the power of the Manhattan Project or the Apollo Project. You know, they're seeing the global impact of the science and getting attracted away from designing the next best app, but they might, say, actually, I want to design the world's next vaccine. We have to make sure we continue to prime that pump because it's critically important. You intersect that with our company's realization that we need more diverse workforces as well. That is going to hopefully unlock investment in making sure that those diverse communities see the promise and the opportunity. They understand that, the average biotech job is twice the salary of a lot of other average jobs in the US at least, and we attract them in the door as well. So we haven't done enough to recruit and attract, but I think we're getting there, and I hope we see a difference in the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, exact same challenge here is the diversity piece, which is really important, but the huge talent pool out there. We know our universities are producing all sorts of very skilled, educated people, and then so our bigger challenge in Canada is just keeping them here, because they get drawn to Cambridge, get drawn to San Francisco, they get drawn to Oxford. By bigger salaries, the appeal of international life and all the rest of it. So that's our big challenge. And then of course bringing more people in from the outside, because 37 million people for Canada, we're not a big enough population on our own to sort of sustain it. But those investments, I mean, governments are making huge investments into our universities and post-secondary institutions in the STEM, the programs, and so more of that, I think, is going to be absolutely critical. We know that other jurisdictions are experiencing the same. They're all investing in their biotech sectors. They're going to be looking for talent. And how long before Brazil starts to take people away, or India, or people are going to go everywhere, right? We're all mobile.
It's super interesting that you say that, because if you look at it from not just in healthcare, but if you look at industrial biotechnology as well, when you see that there's now a generational change in manufacturing process. So things are moving from chemical derived to biologically derived. So you have multiple sectors that weren't life sciences that are now progressing towards that, which is also amazing, obviously from our perspective. But again, you need the people to be able to make that change, because it's such a massive change in production technology. So that's really encouraging for Europe, at least, because we have so many of those sort of traditional sectors which we need to move from so that we can meet Green Deal objectives. And the skills base is going to change entirely associated with that.
Yeah. I do wonder what's going to happen with this intersection of remote work and the team-based approach that we have in biotech. Biotech is a team sport. People are used to being in critical mass, not just within their company, but within biotech clusters. We talk San Francisco, Boston, for example. I wonder how that is going to play out as talent diffuses and more of the roles become remote. It'll be interesting to see.
It will be. Some companies need labs, so you physically have to be in a lab to do some of that work. But as we know, there's a number of platform technologies out there that are computer-based modeling. They're doing drug testing on computers. They don't need to be in labs. They can be doing it from anywhere. So you could do it from the middle of Omaha, or you could do it from anywhere in Europe, right? You just don't have to be physically in Cambridge. So I mean, I don't think this is unique to our sector. I think the entire economy is going to adjust to this sort of Zoom world that everybody's sort of able to work remotely. They're allowing people to live in different parts of the country. They don't have to physically be in an urban center. But I think the other interesting part of your point, Michelle, is there's a benefit to that cluster, right? You get a lot of energy out of it. You will take risks because if you go to the cluster and it doesn't work out, which is always the case, or 90% of the time for our companies, they don't actually succeed because science is binary that way. But when it doesn't work out, you've got somewhere else to go the next day almost. And so if you're in Cambridge,
Right.
as one of my CEOs famously said, it doesn't work out at the company that you're at, you can go to a company the next day and not even have to change your parking spot. And there's kind of a benefit to that, right? And then of course you get all these people together, and that cluster creates more energy and more ideas. Clinical trials are another important part where ideas come out of, and so there is a physical reality to our business, even though quite a bit of it could be done remotely. I think that we may lose out on, at least in the temporary time ahead.
Yeah.
No,
And I hope our R&D teams don't get divorced from the other functions in our companies. One of my member companies was saying the other day they were back to work. And then they decided actually that manufacturing was at such a risk, and R&D was at such a risk that they couldn't risk the rest of the functions bringing in any COVID exposure to those teams because it would crater the whole company. And so they sent the other teams home. So we're going to have some cultural divides within even our small to mid-sized companies that kind of belies the whole feeling of biotech startup where everybody's in it together.
And you have the clustering effect. You can have a clustering, the clustering effect is where the output is greater than the sum of the parts. But if all the parts are just online, you don't get a clustering effect. You could literally get it from anywhere. And that's when you lose the genius conversations over coffee and, doing whatever you do. So that's the risk. And we've been back in the office since the start of September, and it's been so amazing because you function and you get stuff done, but there's so much more being achieved now. So I think we have to find a medium. I mean, COVID is going to dictate how closely we can interact for a while longer yet. But hopefully they'll take the benefits from the online access, but meld it back into, personal interaction.
Yeah, it's challenge. I mean, the whole world is shifting, and some of it needs to figure itself out. And certainly, I know from talking to a lot of our companies, they're even trying to figure out how do you go back to the office. They know how important it is, and getting people back together over that water cooler, over coffee in the kitchen, whatever it is. And they know what genius comes out of that, and that's a critical part of the business. Just we got a couple minutes left. All three of our organizations are more than just the life sciences, health, drugs. Claire, you referenced it a bit earlier. We also have our industrial, agricultural, environmental biotechnology. Hey, guess what? The world is still growing. We're adding more people by the day. We expect to be at 10 billion people. There's some significant challenges. We have to feed that population, keep them healthy, but also reduce our impact on the planet. I think what I found interesting and a little bit alarming was what it was 3 or 4 weeks ago, the UN IPCC International Panel on Climate Change released a report that essentially said we're in a situation like one of those large ships on the ocean, that if we don't do something to sort of alter its course, we're in for some real trouble. On the upside, our industry, like it has in COVID, can have a lot of the solutions that are going to allow us to alter the course of that ship. So I'm going to do the kind of radio tease, as they would say, to sort of say, I want to set up another conversation. I think we need to devote a significant amount of time to having that conversation on behalf of our members, because I think it's both an alarming signal that was sent out by the international panel, but it's also an encouraging signal that let's get people to wake up. I think if we did have that alarm sent out to us around COVID, there were lots of scientists around the world that warned us that there was a pandemic that was inevitable and we should have prepared for it. We now have this. We've known about climate change for some time, so what are we going to do to address it? And I think our industry can play an absolutely central role. So I'll pass it to you and see if you had some thoughts, and then get your agreement that we can come back and have this conversation, because I think it would be a to hear what's going on within our organizations, with our members, what sort of ideas are coming out and what's happening there. And Claire, I'll let you go lead on this and go to Michelle.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of, having come from an agricultural background and a crop production background originally. I see the complexities of food production, and I see most people are not particularly aware of the complexities and depth of food production. There's very much, happy chickens in a field kind of approach to where food comes from. But if I was going to say anything, we need a massive change in production systems. And we need to do it now. It needs to be done significantly, and we have to do it at a massive scale. We don't have many harvests left before things start to fail catastrophically. So wherever we can, we should be changing production systems to reduce the environmental impact of them. And that involves large-scale transition to microbial production of food and feed products. So it's a really simple message. We just have to do it right now.
It's so key and so important. We've been trying to bring our biopharma companies much closer into contact with our agricultural and industrial biotech companies. For the first time, we've set up a council of sustainability officers from our biopharma companies, so they can start learning more about the products, approaches, even advanced experience of our ag and industrial sectors in terms of combating climate change. But this is a conversation that's just starting globally as well. We need to make sure we're doing everything to help and support ag and industrial, but we also need to make sure that our health companies realize how critical this is, because they're a substantial part of the impact too. But yes, I'm happy to come back and talk about this. I think it's a really important topic.
It's fantastic. I think if the dinosaurs were around here today to tell us, they would tell us that the planet will be just fine. It's us as a species that's at risk. So we have to figure out something to do. Otherwise, we're in a heap of trouble. So I'm going to take you up on that, that we've got agreement there to sort of have a further conversation. I think it would be fascinating. Even ideas like that, Michelle, I think would be really interesting. We're going to wrap it up. One final thought I just want to say, Michelle, is to thank you to you and your organization, your entire team. I know most of your focus is in the US, but you do a lot of work internationally that we've worked, both Claire's organization and my organization have really benefited from the work that your team does internationally. The WTO, the TRIPS waiver was a great example of how your leadership and your team's leadership on that has actually affected some really important change, and we were really pleased to be supported and to support the initiative there. So I just wanted to recognize the work that you do and how important it is. I know it's not easy, that you're the stewards for all of us in some respects because of your size, and but we do appreciate it. And of course, we all hope that we're back together physically for the next BIO, which is going to be in June of 2022. It's an important event in everybody's calendar, and certainly we all hope to be back and connected again, and connecting as just like over the water cooler. This is the international version of the water cooler. It's where it happens, right? So thank you for that, and we hope we're back together. Thank you both very much for the time today. It was great to connect, and great to see you both, and I hope everybody's well in your organizations, and wish you all the best, Claire, the rest of the afternoon, and Michelle, we've got the rest of the day. So all the best, and I look forward to talking again soon. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was really great.